בוקר טוב לכולם. ברשותכם, על אף שאני הייתי רוצה לדבר עברית, אני אעבור לשפה האנגלית מפאת האורחים. Good morning, everybody. My name is Gabriel Motzkin. I'm the director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. And I feel a special honor in being asked to open this day, which celebrates one of my very oldest friends in this country, Professor Rivka Feldhay. I want to make 3 points about Rivka before we start the day. I want to talk about her for a minute as a scholar, as a woman, and as a friend. All three dimensions I think we all recognize. Now, one of the things that struck me about Rivka Feldhay throughout her career is that she always had very clear priorities as a scholar. Her scholarship came before any administrative job that she did. It was her number one commitment, her commitment to the early modern history of science, to the whole question of the rise of modernity on the basis of medieval thought, to all these questions, and she devoted her life to this pursuit, and that is one of the reasons this conference is taking place. It's not always clear. You know, when you are in an academic situation like ours, you're always being tempted. I succumbed to the temptation to take administrative jobs of different kinds, just so that professional administrators don't do them. Rivka kept high the flame of scholarship and made a major contribution both to the early modern history of science and especially to intellectual life in this country, and we hope that that will continue to be the case for many years to come. Now, I want to say a word about Rivka as a woman. Rivka belongs to a transitional generation of women, a transitional generation in this sense that when Rivka was young, she did not imagine that she would have an academic career. She thought she was going to be a teacher in a school, and she prepared herself to teach in a school, and as it happened in the course of studying, she became seduced by the intellectual adventure. But even then, the role that a woman plays in academics in the early 70s, whenever it was, late 70s, whatever it was quite different from the role that a woman plays in academics today. And Rivka was in the vanguard of this movement by which women became full partners in the academic enterprise. And that's quite a transition. We seem to think it's quite obvious today because we tend to forget the recent past, even more than the distant past, and we forget how hard it was for women in the 60s to imagine this kind of career. Rivka is an example of that. Third, I want to say a word as a friend. Now, I came back to Israel in 1982, and I felt somewhat alienated due to my upbringing in other countries. One of the first people who extended their hand in friendship to me was Rivka Feldhay, and she was in many ways an avenue and a bridge to being integrated into this academic community. Now that happened because she had a key position at this Van Leer Institute. At the time it was run by someone you all, most of you might remember, Yehuda Elkanah. And Yehuda Elkanah's right-hand person was Rivka Feldhay, and she ran many of the intellectual activities at the Institute. In fact, I was sure she was going to have this job, but again, she preferred scholarship. And so she didn't have this job. But over the years, she has been a steady and loyal friend, not only to me, I imagine, but to all her friends, making sure that she infuses the academic enterprise with that personal warmth of which she is so capable. And I think, on terms of all three, we have to honor her, we have to respect her achievements, and we hope that we will hold another conference in 20 years in your honor. I don't know if I'll be here, but I'm sure you will. So that all said, it's a great privilege for me to stand here, and I wish you a wonderful day. I'll try to participate as much as I can. And I'm going to ask Menachem Fish to come and take over and invite the speakers to the podium. Enjoy yourselves. Ask hard questions.
Yeah. It's an extraordinary pleasure for me to participate, to especially to chair this session in this hall in honor of Rivka, because it is in this very room in 1981 or 2 that we first met. I just completed an MA thesis on the Raven's Paradox, a classic model example of armchair analytical philosophy of science, replete with attempts to refute Bayesianism and with heady formulae. When Yehuda invited me to participate in the HPS seminar, I think on the anthropology of knowledge that he was conducting here, Gabi spoke about women in academia. Rivka, his star pupil, was here. Diana, Mara, the late Mara, Yemima, if I remember correctly, Yaron Mizrahi, and many others. And Eisenstadt was at this table, and Yehuda, and several more. And I was agog. I didn't understand a word they were saying. It was all about the Great Divide. Robin Horton's name was bandied around, Ernst Gellner, and so on and so forth. People I'd never heard of. And this was cutting-edge HPS, totally unrelated to anything I'd done until then, and I was fascinated. Now, close to then, the show moved to Tel Aviv, and Rivka and I, we were assigned as teaching assistants to Yuda's intellectual history course, and thank God for Rivka. She prepared a wonderful reader, beginning with Ficino. Do you remember that? Beginning with it began with Ficino and Pico, and went through, and there I got my teaching that reader. I began getting an education and finding my voice. And as Rivka was finishing her PhD, which started here in Jerusalem, I was completing mine at Tel Aviv. I think I can boast the first PhD from the then not yet Cohen Institute. Rivka and I finished our dissertations in the space of 2 or 3 weeks. We called ourselves Hansel and Gretel. We still do. And you know, we've been part and parcel of the Cohen Institute ever since. And well, what can I say? My late father was fond of talking of full professors as people with great futures behind them. He was a living refutation of that, just as Rivka is, and a formula that many would apply to academic retirees, but couldn't be farther than the truth in Rivka's case. So this conference is a clear tribute, not to a summary or a celebration of your past achievements, dear Rivka, but to how you enrich the present and are still marking out paths for the future by means of your current thinking and writing, and the students you have raised and trained and what they are doing now. This isn't a past-looking conference on any sense of the term. So I don't know what the word is for the opposite of retiring, but this is what we're celebrating today. A richly deserved celebration, Rivka. May you go, as we say in Hebrew, from strength to strength. Our second speaker this morning, Hanan Yoran, a student of Rivka's, senior lecturer at the Department of History at Ben Gurion. His main field of research is Renaissance humanism. In his book published in 2010, Between Utopia and Dystopia, Erasmus, Thomas More and the Humanist Republic of Letters, he examined the construction of identity of the universal intellectual in the discourse of Erasmian humanism and the internal tensions of this identity. More recently, he's been working on 15th and early 16th century Italian humanism at the Minerva Center at Tel Aviv, together with Raz Chen, who just asked you that question, and Gur Zak. He organizes a workshop on Renaissance humanism and the ambiguities of modernity. Hanan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nachem.
Here's where you hear better.
In my first year as a student of the humanities, I took with Rivka a tutorial, קריאה מודרכת, about Renaissance humanism. I don't know how we came to choose this subject. Rivka, perhaps you remember. It certainly was my idea. I didn't know even the term, I think. But that's what we choose.
Can you speak to the mic, please?
Anyway, quarter of a century later, I am now an historian of Renaissance humanism, thinking about the same question that came up on this first tutorial with Rivka. And one of these questions is certainly the question of modernity, the alternative path to modernity, or critical reflection on modernity. Being a student of Rivka, I was sure that that's the usual stuff that historians deal with. Took me a long time and many misunderstandings to understand that is not the case. For most historians, these kind of questions are suspicious, they are contentious, they are speculative, and they do not like them. 2 weeks ago, in the annual meeting of the Renaissance Society of America, one historian defined theory as the Babylonian captivity of history. That I think represents more the attitude of the historian towards kind of questions. So one of the many things I have to thank Rivka for is for this intellectual disposition that seems to me so natural. Thank you. At the beginning of these decades, 2 acclaimed books about the early modern roots of modernity were published. Stephen Greenblatt's The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, and Brad Gregory's The Unintended Reformation, How Religious Revolution Secularized Society. Greenblatt locates the origin of modernity in the Renaissance, specifically in the revival of Epicureanism by the humanists. Modernity, in this narrative, is essentially a process of dismantling religious mystifications, fears, and prohibitions, replacing them with rational scientific thought, belief in human autonomy, and rehabilitations of human desires. Gregory's narrative of modernity begins with the Protestant Reformation. It is also a story of secularization, but is different from Greenblatt's as the 2 authors' understanding of modernity is. For Gregory, it is a story of loss of meaning and value, leading to our own inability to articulate any substantive conception of the good, coupled with destructive capitalism, consumerist capitalism. One aspect of the difference between the 2 narratives is of special importance for my discussion. Greenblatt's narrative suggests a growing true consciousness of external reality as well as of human agency. Gregory, by contrast, as the title of his book makes clear, underscores the unintended consequences of the activity of the historical actors and implied that reality becomes more opaque as modernity unfolds. The two works illustrate the argument of my paper about the contrast between what I term the Renaissance and the Protestant narratives of modernity. The Renaissance narrative accepts modernity's self-understanding as rational, coherent, and self-conscious attitude towards reality. The Protestant narrative, by contrast, rejects modernity's self-understanding. While it does emphasize rationalization as a central dimension of modernity, it argues also that modernity has an irreducible irrational core. It thus underscores modernity incoherences and pathologies. I will further argue that the different historical narratives and perceptions of modernity assume different notion of historicity. They have different answers to the question, what is a historical object? Let me begin by schematically delineate the basic assumptions of the two narratives, highlighting both their points of agreement and their differences. Obviously, both narratives contrast modernity with the Middle Ages. More informatively, both see scholastic realism as the distinct expression of the medieval, that is, the pre-modern worldview. For both, medieval nominalism complicates the picture, but I won't go into it now. Realism, in this view, perceived reality as a unified, hierarchical, rational whole. Specifically, realism assumed that behind phenomenal reality lies an intelligible and unchangeable substance that human reality partook in or reflected the objective order of being. Both narratives sees the advent of modernity as the outcome of the rejection of these assumptions. They differ, however, concerning the questions how they were rejected and what replaced them. According to the Renaissance narrative, developed by Hans Baron and Eugenio Garen and subsequently reformulated by many others, humanist discourse presupposed that human reality was a human artifact rather than a reflection of the objective order of the cosmos. This presupposition informed in turn humanist conception of human agency, namely the affirmation of the vita activa, the purposeful activity aimed at fashioning reality according to human will. For if reality is a changeable human artifact, then shaping it is a worthwhile, indeed noble activity, while if it is given, then the best thing one can do about it is to contemplate and admire its order, beauty, and rationality. Hence, of course, the traditional classical and medieval preference for the vita contemplativa. According to the Protestant narrative, by contrast, the insistence of the Reformers' theology on God's absolute transcendence and the elimination of all mediating means between God and men and women, resulting in disenchanting the world, that is, emptying reality, both natural and human, for divine presence and supernatural happenings. The disenchantment of the world had paradoxical consequences. It eliminated the fairly clear distinction between the religious and the secular, particularly between religious works and secular activity of medieval Christianity and post-Trinitarian Christian Catholicism. In Protestant theology, there is no, strictly speaking, religious works, as salvation depends on faith alone. But precisely this intolerable reduction of the religion into the inner depths of the believer's soul made possible the eruption of the religion to any field. Because almost nothing is of religious significance, anything, any aspect of reality, could become of religious value. Because there are no well-defined religious activities, all activity can become religious. This potential is fully realized in Calvinism, which attributed religious value to many aspects of human activity hitherto perceived as religiously neutral. Like the humanists, the Calvinists, therefore, set out to refashion reality. But they have done so on very different terms. While the humanists perceive human activity in human terms, at human ends, the Calvinists saw their activity as the execution of divine will. This difference of the kind of agency that informed the human effort of reshaping reality had far-reaching consequences for the two narratives of modernity. I would like to examine them in two key aspects of modernity, economics and, if I have time, politics also. Within humanist discourse, the affirmation of an economic activity is a particular manifestation of the affirmation of the vita activa. It was, however, especially radical and problematical one, given the prevailing contemporary values and convictions. Specifically, the humanists who elaborated the positive value of economic activity had to engage with two different discourses and to overcome two sets of objections. On the one hand, the Christian objection to the pursuit of riches as one of the most pernicious of all worldly temptations. On the other hand, the classical perception of work as an inferior activity, ideally suitable only for slaves. the commercial financial activity of the merchant, the early modern merchant, the man who worked for accumulating wealth, lay at the intersection of these two negative attitudes. The social visibility of the medieval and early modern merchant intensified the problem. Providing a theoretical and ethical basis for economical activity was therefore a complicated endeavor and was only gradually accomplished. It was fully achieved by Leon Battista Alberti's I Libri della Famiglia, or more accurately, through one of the voices of this polyphonic dialogue, which reconstructed the vita economica as a good in itself. This approach was described by some, notably Werner Sombart, as a full-fledged manifestation of the capitalist ethos and mental disposition. Alberti's speaker, Giannozzo, who preaches this creed to the enthusiast youth of the family, is an old merchant. He is proud of his occupation, of his wealth, as well as his work, which he perceives as the core of his social identity. Indeed, so satisfied he is with his life dedicated to acquisition of wealth that he seems to discard any other way of life. Political activity, universally accepted by the humanist and the Aristotelian alike as the most excellent kind of the vita activa, he rejects as the worst way of life. A key notion of Alberti's discourse is masserizia, a term with a wide range of meanings. Specifically, it means thriftiness, and Giannozzo's discussion of the notion is emotionally and ethically charged. Masserizia, he says, is santa, and squandering money is a deadly foe, indeed madness. He consequently elaborates at length the distinction between necessary and unnecessary spendings. More generally, masserizia can be translated as good management, which means, in Della Famiglia, a full rationalization of economic activity. Alberti's discussion of household management and economic activity generally elaborates a utilitarian approach aimed at maximizing material gain through rational calculation. This sort of conduct, Alberti knows well, requires a distinct mental disposition, indeed a distinct type of subjectivity, which Giannozzo embodies and depicts at length. In this vein, Alberti orders self-mastery, mastery of one's body and soul. Above all, he stresses the importance of careful and systematic use of one's time for productive purposes. Sleeping and eating can always be delayed for tomorrow, he says, recounting his habit of preparing each morning timetable for the day and diligently checking it in the evening. Alberti's position is informed by coherent anthropology. Man is a self-interested creature who instrumentally promotes his interest, mainly through struggle with other individuals. This view is bound to produce distrust and even misanthropy, and Giannozzo is certainly suspicious of anyone he interacts with, the supplier of his goods, the peasants on his land, the servants in his house, and the fattori he handpicked to help him run his business. Alberti is not shy to sanction the ethical implication of this anthropology. A man wants to live for himself, not for the community, he declares, and his pieces of practical advice clearly reflects this conviction. The most memorable of these is his lengthy discussion of the strategies to wear out and shake off friends who ask for loan. Sombart emphasizes that contrary to what may appear at first sight, this individualistic ethos and instrumental attitude towards others actually complement what Sombart calls business morality. Both commercial honesty, particularly honoring one's promise and contracts, and more generally, bourgeois respectability, are essential for one's reputation and ultimately for one's economic success. Later generation of tradesmen, concludes Sombart, were taught nothing different from what Alberti asked his Eisfeld to lay to heart. Sombart is ambivalent about the ethical dimension of capitalism, and the pages of his various works on the subject are populated not only with Florentine merchants and intellectuals, but also with more colorful but ethically doubtful types, dubious type. Pirates and prostitutes, Jews and Americans. Later became racist and anti-Semite, but that's beside the point. Epistemologically, however, the picture is very clear. The transition from pre-capitalist to capitalist society is a process of intellectual progress and emancipation. Traditional society, in this view, is static and mystified. It perceives the social order is given. In the simplistic version of this vision, the social order is anchored in tradition. It is as it has always been, and ultimately in nature. The sophisticated version, Lombard refers to the wonderful system of Aquinas. The sophisticated version anchors social reality in the unchangeable order of being. In any case, this vision of reality is imminently linked to what Lombard sees as the lack of initiative, clear thinking, mental energy, and intellectual discipline, indeed the lack of individuality that characterized pre-capitalist society. In the economic field, these limitations are evident in, among other things, the inability to perform exact calculation and the incredibly sloppy bookkeeping of even the greatest medieval merchants. Pre-capitalist men and women were in this respect like children of today, says Lombard, echoing the famous notion that the advent of enlightenment is the process of man's emergence from immaturity. In his famous thesis, Max Weber explicitly rejected the theory of the Renaissance origin of modern capitalism, offering instead a Protestant genealogy. The difference between the two narratives ultimately revolves around the notion of capitalism itself. Weber agrees that capitalism is rationalization of economic activity, the pursuit of profit and forever renewed profit by means of continuous rational enterprise. As such, however, capitalism is neither modern nor Western. Indeed, it has existed in all civilized countries of the earth. Modern capitalism is unique. It is informed by distinct ethos or spirit, which Weber demonstrates by long quotes from two advice books of Benjamin Franklin, appropriately commemorating on the most famous banknote in the world. At the basis of this ethos lies the categorical ethical imperative to make money for making money. I quote, "This ethic, the earning of more and more money, combined with a strict avoidance of all spontaneous enjoyment of life, is above all devoid of any eudaimonistic, not to say hedonistic admixture. It is thought of purely as an end in itself, so purely as an end of itself, that from the point of view of the happiness of, or utility to, the single individual, it appears entirely transcendental and absolutely irrational. Man is dominated by the making of money, by acquisition as the ultimate purpose of life. Money, the means par excellence, become in modern capitalism an end in itself. At the heart of the instrumental rationality of modern capitalism, there is therefore an irrational core. This irrational core is unique to modern capitalism and is the reason for its distinctive dynamism. Unlike the mere process of rationalization of economic activity, which, in Weber's view, regularly occurs when some fairly common social conditions are met, this irrational core is a theoretical mystery which requires an explanation. Weber's explanation is based on the unintended psychological and cultural consequences of the central Protestant, specific Calvinist religious doctrine. A key aspect of this regards the paradoxical logic of this enchantment mentioned above. In medieval Christianity, work was perceived as religiously neutral. It was something men and women had to do in order to survive. And as such, the obligation to work concerned society as a whole, and not each individual. Indeed, the better sort of men dedicated themselves to religious vocation and philosophical contemplation rather than to work. In Protestant theology, by contrast, a person's occupation came to be perceived as a divine injunction and consequently had to be diligently performed as a religious duty for the glory of God. Work became vocation or calling. Similar paradoxical consequences arose from the central Calvinist doctrine of predestination, the notion that the individual's fate to salvation of the nation is predetermined may seem at first sight to produce a psychological state of inert fatalism. But Weber famously argued that in fact the opposite was true. The believer anxiously looked for sign that he or she is one of the few of God's chosen, and success in one's worldly endeavors came to be perceived as such a sign. In the economic field, success is naturally measured by material wealth. Consequently, the believer strove with all his might to make money. The believer was moreover prohibited from spending the money he earned on pleasures and other worldly objectives. As good Christians, the Calvinists perceived such spending as utterly sinful. The money earned was instead reinvested in one's business. The result was the famous cycle that characterizes capitalism. This is schematically Weber's thesis. Let me emphasize the structure of this explanation. Weber explicitly distinguishes between the emergence of modern capitalism and its reproduction. His thesis regards only the first aspect, the coming of capitalism into being. Concerning the production of the system, Weber repeatedly argues that once it came into being, it is mechanically reproduced itself. Since aestheticism undertook to remodel, I'm quoting, since aestheticism undertook to remodel the world, material goods have gained in increasing and finally inexorable power over the lives of men. Today, the spirit of religious aestheticism has escaped the cage, but victorious capitalism, since it rests on mechanical foundation, needs its support no longer. Indeed, Weber argues that capitalism actively obliterated its own roots. In the long run, the material wealth capitalism generated undermined religion, or at least the kind of religiosity that had produced its spirit. Modern capitalism thus eliminated its own cause. And this historical fact has momentous consequences as it produced the irrational core of modern capitalism. In order to see this, let us think first about the Calvinists. Their attitude and behavior was clearly rational. They worked hard, acquired wealth, and refrained from spending it because they were obeying God's commandment. They desired money as a sign for the state of grace. In the economy of the soul, they were buying their salvation. This may seem bizarre to us, but the crucial point is that for them, money was a means. By contrast, the attitude of the modern capitalist is different. The religious motivation disappeared, and with them, the rational motives of the actors. What remains is the spirit of capitalism, or perhaps the ghost of Calvinism, a rational compulsive urge to work and desire for money for its own sake. To sum up this part, the Renaissance narrative depicts the emergence of modern capitalist economy as a process of epistemological enlightenment, of gradual undermining of mystification concerning economic activity, and of growing individual autonomy and determination to enhance human material conditions. The Protestant narrative, by contrast, portrays a process of increasing opaqueness concerning both economic reality and the individual understanding of his or her own motivations. Indeed, Weber argues that the modern capitalist cannot provide a coherent account of his own activity. His bleak images of modernity, war, survival, iron cage, faithfully described, and I quote, a renunciation, a departure from an age of full and beautiful humanity, inherent in the process of modernization. The same difference characterizes the Renaissance and the Protestant narratives of the emergence of modern politics. I'll describe them briefly. Among the Renaissance narratives, the most well-known is the Republican one offered by Hans Baron and formulated by John Pocock, William Bozeman, and others. In this narrative, Florentine humanism was the origin of modern political notions such as citizenship and political participation, as well as of modern attitudes and beliefs, political in the broad sense of the term, such as secularism, orientation towards the future, and anthropological optimism. In more abstract terms, let me skip this. A Calvinist genealogy of modern politics was offered by Michael Walzer's The Revolution of the Saints. Walzer argues that the essential dimension of modern politics is a sustained effort to radically recreate all aspects of political and social reality in light of coherent ideology which is perceived by its adherents as the absolute truth. This effort is carried out by committed individuals from all walks of life whose loyalty to the ideology overcomes any other kind of bond. These men, later also women, known initially as saints and eventually as citizens, voluntarily organize themselves in parties which struggle to seize power and then to methodically refashion society. As the saints stand for God, their enemies perforce stand for the devil, and consequently the war between them, is a total war, is a total one, a war between good and evil as such. But evil is not only external, it lurks everywhere and threatens to encompass everything. The number of the saved is small, and excluding martyrdom, no outward sign is a sufficient proof of one's state of grace. Even those whose behavior is impeccable and who are apparently in the company of the saints may turn out to be of the devil. The devil also incessantly tempts the flesh of the saints themselves. Even more important, Calvin's doctrine inevitably produced doubt concerning the actual state of oneself. Theologically, a resolute and persistent faith is a sure sign of a state of grace. But psychologically, one's situation is much more ambiguous. His faith may turn out to be elusive. This produced vigilance, continuous mutual supervision, strict discipline within the camp of the saints, from Calvin's Geneva to Cromwell's New Model Army. It also produced strenuous effort of self-disciplining in order to resist the temptation of the flesh and psychologically to curb self-doubts. From Walzer's perspective, the epitome of modern politics is not liberal democracy, but rather the revolutionary parties and the violent revolution from the end of the 18th century onward. And indeed, he makes an explicit analogy between the Puritan saints, the French Jacobins, and the Bolsheviks. Walzer does not discuss, however, the evolvement of modern politics after its first Calvinist phase. He does not examine, therefore, the natures and implication of the secularization of political ideology and activity. There is, however, a relevant notion of secularization offered by thinkers such as Carl Schmitt and Karl Levitt. In this view, key modern notions, progress and sovereignty, for example, are secularized theological concepts, whereas secularization is understood as an unreflective and incoherent use of religious concept outside their proper context. If we employ this concept of secularization to fill the gap in Walzer's narrative, that is, if we see modern political ideology as a secularized version of Calvinist political doctrine and the modern revolutionary party as a secularized version of Calvinist party of the saints, then the Calvinist narrative of modern politics assumes Weberian form of loss of rationality and transparency. The Calvinist political ideas and activity were a direct expression of their religious doctrine. They believed that they were bound to fashion society according to God's will and that the enemies were diabolical agents. The situation of the modern revolutionaries is different in this view. Like Weber's modern capitalists, they are unable to give an adequate account of the beliefs and practices. They think the political ideology is a product of secular, rational, and empirical, indeed, often scientific understanding of reality, while in fact it is a dogmatic construction. The unacknowledged and unaccounted for religious dimension of modern revolutionary ideologies is perhaps most conspicuous and most politically problematical when social conflict is concerned. Modern ideologies are committed to provide objective, again, of the scientific explanation of social conflict in terms of individual or class interest, consciousness, and so forth. But in fact, they presuppose a Manichaean division between good and evil within society. They also presuppose that evil lurks everywhere and can reveal itself even among the apparently loyal. Hence, of course, the extreme violence of modern revolutions, and particularly the inclination to devour their own children. One more minute. The Renaissance and the Protestant narrative of modernity are thus eminently related to two different notions of modernity. They also, I would like to argue, presuppose two different notions of historicity, two different notions of what a historical object, such as modern capitalism and modern politics is. The Renaissance narrative presupposes the commonsensical notion of historicity. It relates the coming into being of an object, but an object which is in itself ahistorical in the sense that it can be fully accounted for without any reference to its history. In practical terms, it means that modern capitalism, for example, can be fully described by economists and sociologists without any historical term, without reference to its history. The Protestant narrative, by contrast, presupposes that the historical object has irreducible historical dimension in the sense that it cannot be accounted for without reference to its history. The irrational core of modern capitalism, the categorical imperative of making money as an end in itself, cannot be accounted for in any synchronic reconstruction of modern capitalism. Sociologists and economists have no way to explain this dimension. Indeed, it contradicts the economists' fundamental assumption that men and women strive to maximize utility. For the simple reason that it is a relic of the past, a ghost that disrupts the self-understanding of modern capitalism. And the same goes for the secularized religious dimension of modern politics. In this view, the historicity of an object is not only, not even primarily its history, the narrative of its coming into being. It is the unsettling remnants of the past within the object. Thank you very much.
I'll allow one question, but Ofer, it goes to you, but you're the only thing that stands between us and the coffee break. The same goes to you.
So thanks a lot. It was a very erudite and interesting. So a comment about that I think connects both is that it occurred to me while listening to both that if you think about the revolution as the both scientific and political term, both the nostalgia for a better past and the worry about this, what revolution means in terms of violence and loss, is there from the very beginning. And I give two. It's tempting to think about the Galileo and the Jesuits in these terms, but the expert is here. So two examples. When Cavendish, Margaret, goes to the Royal Society, looks through the microscopes, her complaint is exactly this. If you look through the microscope at louse and see an elephant, you've lost the louse. That's in order to get the elephant, you lose the louse. And again, politically, the boys, it's a very feminist piece, the boys that sit around doing that, those gentlemen, are neglecting what they're supposed to do, namely to run a society in a rational way. They live in some dream of that the telescope provides. And even more pertinent, in a sense, example is the person that coins the term scientific revolution is Madame Lavoisier. She's the first one, at least I know, that uses this term. Of course, for her, revolution is it means all the good things that it meant before the revolution, progress and rationality and so on. She speaks about the revolution we do. When Priestley writes back to her after Lavoisier was beheaded, and also he uses again this very term turned on its head. What does it mean, revolution? Is that we don't talk, not like we used to do, that we had rational discourse, and what you're offering, right, this new, right, post-revolution chemical knowledge comes at the price, right? So again, this nostalgia of the times we really knew matter, right? We chemists knew by personal name this thing and that thing, this thing and that thing, this color, this taste. So the nostalgia, I think, was always there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ofer. I'm going to resist the quip that this was also a comment on Gabby's opening remark about women in science and academe with your two examples. Thank you very much, both speakers.